Imagine waking up every single day knowing that your entire life, the luxuries you enjoy, the titles you claim, literally every coin in your pocket is built on a foundation of absolute fiction. Picture holding an entire nation hostage with nothing more than a whispered secret, a completely fabricated bloodline, and a boldness so absolute that kings and politicians simply didn't dare to question it. We're talking about a time way before modern databases, before DNA tests, and long before digital verification. Identity was built entirely on trust, class, and social performance. And honestly, no one mastered that dark art quite like a 19th century woman who called herself Helga de Brache.
It's a pretty staggering question to ask, right? What if your entire life was a fiction? Especially when we look at the source material for today's explainer. For over a decade, this woman successfully convinced the Swedish government and high society that she was the secret, discarded royal daughter of a fallen king. But beneath the velvet dresses and the official royal petitions lay a really startling reality. We're looking at an individual who built an identity on pure fiction and successfully extracted a lifelong state pension from a government, navigating a world long before the era of digital verification.
Okay, let's dive into this. Section 1. The Grand Illusion.
And this brilliantly illustrates the sheer contrast at the heart of the con. To history, she's known as Helga de Brache, the majestic secret royal. But the archival reality, Aurora Florentina Magnusson. Today we're exploring one of the most astonishing historical deceptions of the 19th century, a truly chilling masterclass in social engineering and psychological manipulation. You see, she wasn't actually born into royalty, not even close. Born in Stockholm in 1817, she was the daughter of a humble caretaker. Lacking the means to provide her with an extensive education, her early life was spent working regular, grueling jobs just to survive, serving as a maid and a bookkeeper for various households.
Now you have to remember, life in 19th century Sweden offered virtually no upward mobility for a working-class woman. Class lines were these rigid, impenetrable walls. If you were born into the working class as a maid, the societal expectation was that you basically stayed there until the day you died. There was absolutely no climbing the corporate ladder. Unless, of course, you decided to completely invent a new lineage and bypass the class system entirely.
Section 2. Forging a Royal Identity.
During her early working years, Aurora lived a pretty nomadic life, moving between Sweden and Finland with a teacher named Henrika Aspegran. She actually tested her aristocratic flair by establishing a ladies' school in Turku, Finland. But then, realizing people simply don't question absolute authority, she discarded the name Aurora and aimed right for the apex of society. Just look at the timeline of the fabricated backstory she engineered. It is an absolute dramatic masterpiece. She claimed to be the secret, illegitimate daughter of the deposed King Gustav IV of Sweden and Queen Frederica of Baden. According to her narrative, her royal parents hid her birth to protect her from political chaos, and she was raised in secret by the king's aunt, Princess Sophia. Then the timeline gets darker. She claimed that when the princess died in 1829, Helga was locked away in asylums to silence her true identity. This was such a brilliant psychological trap. By framing her actual, very ordinary institutional background as a tragic, state-sponsored conspiracy, any skepticism directed at her was instantly deflected. If you questioned her, you weren't just being cautious, you were being cruel to an innocent victim of state injustice.
Let's move to and see how this builds in Section 3. Mechanics of Deception.
So how exactly did she bypass the critical thinking of politicians and elites to pull off this grand illusion? Well, the fraud worked by exploiting the polite social codes of the era. First, the power of paperless pleading. In an era before centralized identification, people relied heavily on personal testimony and social presentation. Helga perfectly played the role of a delicate, refined aristocrat who had just fallen on hard times. Second, she weaponized forbidden history. By claiming a connection to the deposed royal family, she capitalized on extreme administrative delicacy. Bureaucrats were absolutely terrified of causing a diplomatic or political embarrassment, so they just hesitated to press her for proof. Finally, this all culminated in her boldest move, the 1861 petition for relief, where she formally asked the Swedish government for a royal annuity based entirely on this unverified, highly sensitive narrative.
So the crucial point is the financial stakes she managed to secure were massive. Once the Swedish government actually approved her petition in 1861, Helga was granted a substantial annual pension of 2,400 Swedish riksdaler straight from the taxpayers. But that wasn't all. Because she played the victim so perfectly, compassionate and charitable supporters in the private sector donated heavily to her cause too. She was living a life of relative luxury, fully supported by the state and private charity, while the real truth remained hidden behind a wall of polite social convention.
Section 4. The Unraveling. No illusion lasts forever, right?
And every lie leaves footprints for those willing to look closely enough. The facade held incredibly well for years, but eventually the cracks began to show. Skeptical journalists and certain members of parliament began to look past the social taboo and actually examine the timeline of her claims. When subjected to strict scrutiny, the logistical impossibilities of her birth narrative, the matching of dates, locations, and historical records of the actual royal family, well, the whole thing began to completely unravel.
The investigators were methodical. Between 1876 and 1877, they followed these exact steps. They started by examining the timeline of her royal claims and found the glaring holes. Then they did what the bureaucrats in 1861 were too afraid to do. They investigated local parish birth records. Finally, they traced her actual physical movements. And guess what? The trail didn't point to German convents or royal nurseries like she had claimed. Nope. Following the breadcrumbs led them directly back to Stockholm, back to the reality of the caretaker's daughter, Aurora Florentina Magnusson.
Section 5. The Final Reckoning.
When a truth was officially brought to light, the fallout was massive. The public was totally stunned by the sheer audacity of the performance. The case culminated in a highly publicized trial that captivated all of Sweden, and the legal system actually struggled with how to handle this. She was charged with identity fabrication and fraud. The verdict exposed her completely, and her state pension was permanently revoked. But interestingly, because the fraud was built almost entirely on social manipulation rather than traditional theft, the legal penalties resulted only in fines rather than severe prison time. However, her social standing, the very thing she had spent her life building, was instantly and totally obliterated.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the bizarre detail of her final years. You would think that after being utterly exposed in a national trial, she would drop the act. But she didn't. Until her death in 1885, living quietly alongside her longtime companion Henrika Aspegren, witnesses noted that she fiercely maintained her performance as a royal. Even on her deathbed, far away from the high society she had infiltrated, she never broke character. It was truly a lifelong performance.
So what does this all mean? What is the core takeaway of this explainer? It really comes down to this definition: institutional vulnerability. It's the susceptibility of human institutions to manipulation based on unchecked narratives and the desire to believe compelling stories. Helga succeeded not just because she was clever, but because her story filled a psychological gap for people who were drawn to the drama of royalty and tragedy. Her case highlights exactly how unchecked authority and unchecked narratives can easily bypass critical thinking. People wanted to believe her compelling story, so they just suspended their disbelief. And let's be honest, this is a lesson that is absolutely just as relevant today in our digital age as it was in 19th century Sweden.
Verification matters. Proof matters. This quote perfectly summarizes the ultimate lesson of the Helga de la Brache scandal. Charm and a compelling backstory can build an empire out of thin air, until reality catches up. Identity can be incredibly fragile, but the truth, no matter how long it is buried beneath layers of careful performance and social engineering, for sure always finds a way to the surface.
I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. If a caretaker's daughter could fool an entire government into funding her life based purely on a well-told story and social hesitation, what unchecked narratives are human institutions falling for today? Where are we letting our desire to believe a compelling story override our demand for verification? If you found this explainer on historical deception as fascinating as I did, make sure to subscribe and join us as we continue to uncover the most riveting stories hidden in the shadows of history. Thanks for learning with us today, and stay vigilant out there.